Hi, Greg.
Hello, Hugh. Happy full moon. And one day after solstice, it is now officially summer and it is scorching hot here.
It's over 100 here.
And look at that full moon picture that you took years ago. We saw that today on Channel 10. They stole it and used your picture because you didn't have it copyrighted or anything. You just took it off the internet. And that's amazing how much they copy your
No, it's
stuff.
copyrighted in every
Is it?
video, we make.
Oh, that's true. Like
But
that. So they
but
they have no
the
use
the
though.
news has taken my photos off the internet and using them in their newscast
Unreal. And that's why all the news has bottom line events. They're always stealing from you and have been for years.
all my life.
We've been watching so many. In fact, I put them all on Facebook that I could find. Every news channel has some sort of bottom line events. Bottom, even ESPN has bottom line.
All the movies do too.
Yeah, yeah. And wrestling bottom line events. It's unreal.
Yeah, my stolen trademark.
So we
That's
didn't.
what I get for hiring Weiner and Associates to protect it.
That's yeah. So you
When I
hired
when I was
as
when I was 15 years old, I was performing at on Telegraph Road at the restaurant Jimmy Hoffa disappeared from, and I walked across the street to Weiner and Associates, a law firm, handed them $300 and told them to protect my trademark. And he went to New York and sold it to DuPont
mm-hmm.
and Edelstein, and my trademark showed up all over the globe instead of him protecting it. And that was Clinton's buddy.
Yep.
Remember?
Yeah, that's the one showing his private to kids and stuff on his
Minor
phone or
online, yeah. And he
hmm
just happened to have a law firm across the street from where Jimmy Hoffa disappeared.
what a coincidence.
Yeah. Everything in my life is just a coincidence. Yeah.
Right, right.
That's what the police say. As little kids are murdered all around me all my life.
Yeah, as you're left for dead at an airport, and then the plane
You know,
crashes
when
and
my twin was murdered, the Patterson family showed up in my life at my high school, and Brooks showed up in my life as my aunt and uncle on that very day.
okay, I wasn't ready for that. Say the first part again.
Brooks, L Brooks Patterson, the Brooks family showed up in my life on the very day my twin was murdered. They were introduced to me as my aunt and uncle,
Yeah, well, you have newspaper clippings
but
about the Brooks family.
they don't talk about my murdered twin, and they say that child killing started in Oakland County, Michigan, in the '60s, not in the '50s.
You have an obituary you clipped from the newspaper about your Aunt Brooks and stuff. Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah,
And
yeah, and then my government teacher raised Bobby Brooks, and Bobby Brooks tried to kill me. I had to remove her from my home.
that's where the segue was. Okay, it's because we were talking about murders and yeah, and Bobby Brooks was one of your own family members tried to kill you. That's right. Yeah, I see how that goes together.
It's interesting how they always do that.
Have you had other relatives try to kill you as well?
Oh, yeah, my little sister was poisoning my food for years.
Oh, that's right, and she even admitted to it.
Yeah, she told me I asked her why she did it, and she didn't know why. She said because I hated you.
Yeah, that was all
I
she
asked
could
her
say.
why she hated me, and she didn't have an answer. And she was living in a house I bought for my family.
I have to say, your family's probably the most ungrateful group of people I've ever heard of in my entire life because you did a
I
lot for
don't
them.
talk to any of them.
Right. Yeah, so you eventually had
I
to cut them
moved
off.
away 50 years ago, and I don't talk to any. After they stole my federal publishing company and my inheritance, I walked away. And I
Yeah.
don't talk to any of them.
So not only did at least two of your family members try to kill you, but they seem to have also killed your mother too. I mean, they're a violent group of people.
Well, my mother at midnight was talking to me on the day we buried my dad. I was on her front porch at the house I bought for her and my father, and there was nobody there. There was just my little brother inside the house, supposedly sleeping. And she told me she knows her sisters and her firstborn son stole my inheritance. My grandfather left me a big inheritance, and her sisters and my stepbrother stole it from me.
How did one
They
family
even wrote on
become?
the death certificate that my Aunt Gardner wasn't married, and she was married to a guy in prison all his life, and she had a daughter down in Florida. And I don't think these things. She took me to the prison in Marquette State Prison in Michigan, introduced me to her husband, Mr. Gardner, and he was in prison for life because he killed a security guard at the bank she works in, trying to rob it.
Yeah, even the Gardners that are related to Ava Gardner, they're pretty violent people too, apparently.
Yeah, yeah. He
So,
was in
so,
life for he was in jail for life in a state prison.
so Hugh,
But
how
on
did
her death certificate, they say she was never married, which
how
is
did one
fine.
group of people, Hugh, how did one group of people, one family become that disassociated from their morality, and that many of them just become so violent, nasty, and terrible people?
Well, the thing I found interesting was the person in Michigan who signed a death certificate, which was a lie. She was married to Mr. Gardner, and she had a daughter living in Florida all her life. Her daughter and her husband tried to rob the bank she was a teller at, and they murdered a guard. He
Yeah.
went to prison for life because he shot the guard and killed him. And she actually introduced me to those people. She took me to the prison, introduced me to them,
Okay.
told me she had a daughter in Florida. And on her death certificate, the person who signed the death certificate, guess who it was?
I don't know.
It was
Brooks?
Cooper. It was the very
Okay.
family that kidnapped and raped my daughter when she was 7 off her school bus.
Fascinating. Hmm.
And those people, they forged my name on stock that my grandfather left me, and then they divided it amongst all of them. My brother and my sisters took the biggest part, and then they gave each kid in my family, about 30 kids, 10 grand of my money. And they gave me 5 grand as they stole my entire inheritance. My mother was on the porch with me after we buried my father, and we were alone on the front porch of the house I bought for her. And I was living in Tennessee. I had traveled from Tennessee to Michigan to bury my father. And she told me she knew her sisters and her oldest son, my stepbrother, stole my inheritance. And she told me she was going to leave me her inheritance, which was about $30,000. And I left her at about 12:30 and started driving back to Tennessee. And before I got back to Tennessee, she was dead at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning.
So the common denominator in the answer to my question then basically is money. They're just greedy SOBs,
Well,
aren't
there was
they?
nobody in the house other than my little brother David. And
Yeah.
David is the guy my father took a picture of in my uniform,
Mm-hmm.
stealing my band as he
Was it?
graduated from Walsh Business College. And
Yeah.
the world got David Letterman
Mm,
when he received his letter.
makes sense.
And that's because Johnny Carson was my family.
Yeah.
And David Letterman took over the Johnny Carson show. And so my dad took a picture of my little brother stealing my business with Westfall. And Westfall stole your car there in Ohio, didn't
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
he? Your
I
wife's
mean,
car.
we got it back, but yeah, he just took it to his pound there and didn't fix it. Yeah, for several months. Just let it sit there.
Yeah, nice family, huh? He was a
Yeah, kept
heroin
lying to me.
dealer. He was a heroin dealer with Massey. And it's interesting in Greenville, where the police were selling heroin and cocaine with bikers. At the end of my street, the bikers built a clubhouse, the Renegades and the Outlaws, at the end of my street.
Yeah,
Snake Road, Grassy Creek Road. And you had Copperhead Road on the radio,
right.
marking me, and you had David Ball sold me the first house I lived in Tennessee, and he wrote Private Malone driving in his Corvette. So all these musicians in Tennessee followed me, the publisher, to Tennessee, and then they all helped murder my wives. And police and bikers at the end of my street, they half a mile away from my home, they built a biker clubhouse, and they murdered two of my wives and my attorney. And then when my wives and my attorney were dead, they shut the clubhouse down. And then, if you remember, the police went to jail for selling drugs with the bikers. About 15 policemen in Greenville. And they were all working together. Every time I called the police about break-ins at my home, and shovels being dragged across my wife's bedrooms at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, the police would come and use fake names and badge numbers. And all those police selling drugs with the bikers were put in jail by the FBI about 5 years after my wives were murdered. And then I find it interesting that Dolly Parton worked with Holt.
Yeah.
And Holt is the detective that didn't file murder charges on my wife's dismembered body.
Mm-hmm.
That's real interesting.
Yes, it is.
When I put up about Terry being murdered, the victim of attempted murder in Pigeon Forge in front of Dollywood, she'll like the post, but she pretends she doesn't know Detective Holt.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my whole life in Tennessee is like this.
You had a relative of hers as a caretaker or something on a property.
Yeah,
I
he
think,
was
didn't
cutting my grass, Tweed.
Yeah.
Mr. Tweed,
Yeah.
that's her cousin. And Holt was a detective that didn't file murder charges for Terry and Victoria. And they were both murdered by police.
you? Mm-hmm.
And then
Now go.
Johnson City, where they murdered my wife, using her advocate's phone, Walters,
Okay.
they cut her ears off and took her ears. And they screamed at me over her advocate's phone, Mrs. Walters' phone. And Bobby Walters had asked me to burn his properties down and told me he'd give me 10 grand every time I burnt one of his houses or properties down.
For insurance fraud.
And
Yeah.
Walters State College is the biggest college in Tennessee.
Yeah.
Right there in Greenville.
Mm-hmm.
He got this picture. So
Yeah.
he tried to get me to burn his properties down. And when I told him no, his wife's phone was used to murder my wife. And I talked to Mr. Anderson and his wife about Bobby Walters asking me to burn his properties down. And then Mr. Anderson and his wife Patsy were both murdered the following week. But the police wrote that up as natural causes too.
Right.
And Mr. Anderson was gonna talk to Bobby about trying to get me to arson his properties.
Mm-hmm.
As they murdered my wife, using his wife's phone. Real interesting. And then the police in Johnson City, they were taking extortion payments for 60 rapes. These guys were raping women in Johnson City, and they were taking extortion payments, but Where they murdered my wife, the whole police force covered up her murder. And her ears were missing the day they cremated her. The hospital didn't even ask me to cremate her. They just cremated her body the following day. Because they didn't want nobody to know her ears were gone. It's real interesting what they did to me. So the police in Greenville were selling drugs with bikers as they murdered my wives in Greenville. Actually Mossheim, but Greenville police would show up, the county of Greenville, the sheriff. They murdered Victoria and Terry there. And then Johnson City was taking extortion payments. Johnson City, the sheriff there, he told me he was just going to leave the murders up to God, never filed murder reports. And in Greenville, the sheriff there with Holt, the detective, told me he pulled Holt off the case and said it's not his fault the government's corrupt, and he never filed murder charges. And then when I first brought Terry Heath from Wisconsin to protect her from the police that kidnapped her out of her Head Start and CPS offices there, she asked me to help her. So I moved her to Mossheim, Tennessee. We went to Dollywood, and a policeman had our vehicle from behind going 100 miles an hour, and we both had to go to the hospital, and he destroyed my Chevy van. And that was right in front of Dollywood, the first day I brought her there. She wanted to visit Pigeon Forge, Dollywood. I took her there, and the policeman hit us from behind. We were at a traffic light stop, and he was in his personal truck, and he hit us from behind going 100 miles an hour. The very first day I moved her there. So Dolly is concerned about them stealing kids from Dollywood. That's why she liked my post in public.
Yeah.
And she works with the Holt family, who never filed my wife's murder charges. And my wives were raped, sodomized, tortured for 30 days, and dismembered. And they didn't file murder charges. I find all that interesting. And
Well, she definitely has a concern for that in Tennessee then.
Yeah, and then Dolly told me she was going to fly out here and help me with her attorneys, but then her attorneys tried to charge me money, and she told me she was going to pay for them. I told her to forget it. It's very interesting, my life, and all these people, they'll deny all these things. You know, the Greenville Sun was my next door neighbor, the guy that owns the Greenville Sun, Alex Jones.
Yeah, the third, Alex Jones the third, right?
Yeah. And gee, isn't that coincidence? As a major in the Air Force married me to my wife 3 years before the Twin Towers were destroyed by George Bush.
Right.
And he blamed Muslims, and he flew. They were hiding the receipts to my stolen publishing company, bottom line. And I had a civil rights case in the Pentagon on 9/11. They blew it up. And it was against the family that built the Pentagon, the Groves family. It's really interesting how they sent a major to marry me, to pull me out of a park I was playing rock and roll music in with James Taylor. Put me in a church, made me look bad because I was playing rock and roll. And then married me to my wife, and then put me on the Manning Ranch, and Manning co-created the JFK archives. And they murdered 2 of my wives there. And police were hired as hitmen. Terry told me 30 minutes before she walked her dog that she was being stalked again. And she said she knew it was the 2 police that kidnapped her in Wisconsin. She told me those things. When her sister got there, she had told me that her and her sister had a fist fight right in her home. So her sister didn't like her. Her sister pulled the plug on her life support, and she didn't die. She was recovering. And her nurses came to me and said that her sister murdered her. When she didn't die, when they pulled the plug off her life support, then they overdosed her on drugs and murdered her. And her sister took the money. You know, they cleaned my house out, all the furniture. And they even took my furniture and things I bought for Terry. And I know Terry wasn't suicidal. We made love for 2 days straight. She was real happy. We ate dinner. It was my birthday, July 4th, and that's when they murdered her on my birthday.
Hence the birthday cake on that song, Copperhead Road, right?
Yeah. And I lived on Snake Road.
Yeah.
It's real interesting that all my wives were murdered on holidays. Karen was murdered on Christmas Day. Then Terry was murdered on July 4th, and then Vicky was murdered on Halloween. And all these murders were 7 years apart. And there was always police and bikers involved in the murders. And then when I moved out west to California here, they murdered my fourth wife. On the day the FBI shot Lavoy Finicum, they murdered Nancy Lavoy. And they had cut her leg off. And I'm certain that a doctor who was a biker talked her into having her leg removed.
Mm-hmm.
And then they murdered her as they shot Lavoy Finicum. And her name was Nancy Lavoy.
So, Hugh, a whole bunch of times you've been talking about bikers, and I wanted to put this in because I noticed a movie this week called Bike Riders. And I noticed that the person who made it was Nichols.
My next door neighbor.
Yeah, your neighbor and one that was a CIA agent that was selling drugs on one of your properties. And I just know that's not a coincidence there.
Tim McVeigh lived with Nichols.
And the star was Butler.
Yeah, my friend who ran the CIA at Great Lakes Naval Base. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now all these things fit together, and they're hiding my truth of who really killed Hoffa and Kennedy.
Yeah.
And they did that by murdering my family, and they tried to murder me dozens of times. You know that.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't just your family that tried to murder you. A bunch of other people did too.
It's in the book.
Mm-hmm.
My stepbrother pushed me off a 2-story roof. I helped him put a roof on his boathouse, and then he pushed me off it just before my Aunt Gardner died. He was trying to kill me. And then my wife's family, the wife I divorced, who's still alive, the Westhouse family, Mary Westhouse, her family tried to murder me 3 times. Her father put a gun on me as I stopped to pick my wife and kids up from his home.
The night Hoffa died or disappeared or
yeah,
what? Yeah.
Right.
I didn't know yet at that time.
And he had filled in the hole he had dug with a crane. And my horse disappeared. And they had tried to murder me 2 more times prior to him putting a gun with a laser on it at midnight on my forehead.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so after that, I divorced her. And she didn't understand why I divorced her, but her whole family was attempting to murder me after they murdered Jimmy Hoffa.
Wow.
Her family set me up with Whitey. And I bought a car from Whitey, and then the FBI detained me because the car I bought broke down half a mile from Whitey's home. I junked it and bought another car.
Mm-hmm.
And the Westhouse family set me up with Whitey, who was an outlaw biker. And they hide all of this in the news. And I was the very first guy the FBI detained for Hoffa's murder because of Whitey's car. I had at least 7 or 8 agents detain me in front of my kids in my Troy, Michigan driveway.
Mm-hmm.
when I was, I don't know, 20 years old. And
75, 65,
I
50.
had adopted 7 kids and I only had one that was mine. And I find it interesting that Nancy Lavoie, I walked in on her sleeping with a homicide detective that was supposed to be protecting me from 2 people that tried to murder me at my high school. And they stole my car and picked up drugs in an airplane. And they,
Yeah, that was another time they tried to kill you, left you in a bathtub.
yeah, dead. And I woke up underwater in a bathtub. Um, and my car was missing, and they had taken my car to an airport, Mr. Barclay's airport on 16-mile Big Beaver Road, stolen an airplane and picked up drugs to give to the Westhouse family. And then Westhouse came into my life, and Mary Westhouse was 12 years older than me. Her mother was 50 when I was 14. And Cook was 30 when I was 15. And all 3 of those women related to Mary Westhouse were trying to have sex with me before I turned 16 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Even her mother would take her top off and show me her breasts and try to have sex with me. Cook actually tried to give me oral sex in a car when I took her to a store on the day she married my wife's brother, Tony, who was a DI at Fort Knox during the Vietnam War. And he annulled the marriage after I told him.
Smart guy.
Yeah. And they murdered his son. They murdered Karen's daughter, Serena, our daughter,
Yeah.
and 3 kids in my family. Tony Jr. and another Tony Jr. and Serena, all on the same day as I sat in L Brooks Patterson's office trying to talk to L Brooks Patterson and ask him why he never solved the Oakland County child killings.
And that was just 7 years ago.
And yeah, and he knew who beat my twin to death. He watched 5 governors beat my twin to death.
Yeah, back in
He was sitting in the
57.
driveway where they did it.
Mm-hmm.
And he took in $25 million a year from federal taxpayer money. Never put any of those people who murdered my twin in jail. And my twin was brought back with Camille Sirhan from California. After the first time, my mother tried to murder me. And then there's no reference to me being kidnapped or my twin's murder, and his body was thrown in Pennsylvania where the 3rd plane on a 9/11 crash. That's where his body was thrown. And that's where my wife was born, Victoria Mellon. And it's just unbelievable, my life. You wrote a new book.
Yeah, you helped me with the title.
Who did?
You did.
Oh, I did? I don't remember.
Historical Mysteries on Amazon. Now that'll guide a person from the ancient past to the present day, the last chapter being about your life and how ancient symbols have been used and developed to control mankind and still are today, as we can still see pretty plainly in your life today.
What did you put in my life?
What did we put in your life? Well, we mentioned your
It's the last.
baby pictures and 9/11 and the how 42 was on your birth certificates, or not birth certificate, but your baby pictures.
It was
And
44, 44, me and my twin.
Yeah, you had a 44,
two
you had
fours.
a 44 drawn on there with marker. You had a 4 in Roman numerals and a 2 in Roman numerals. So you had 42 in 1963,
And who took the pictures?
and that was George Towers, just like George Bush.
And
And
on
so, yeah,
9/11, 1953. So they planned 9/11 as
right,
cut my father's hands off at
right.
work. Pratt and Behringer did that, cut his hands off. That's why my mother and him weren't there to protect me when I was kidnapped with my twin, and my twin was murdered.
And the Twin Towers are on Pratt Street. And that's why they had Twin Towers to begin
Yeah,
with,
the twin
because of
towers
you
were
and your
both on
brother.
Pratt Street, and then the address on the picture is 1963, 5, the number of people that beat my twin to death on
And
Road Street in
yeah,
Detroit. And I live
1963 is when they killed Kennedy.
on the Rogue River
Yeah.
in California now. It's
So
just unbelievable.
it's just, yeah,
And
it's
then
mind
and then
boggling.
the guy who I went to school with, who robbed that Brinks truck, um, Dan Cooper,
Yeah.
he died racing my friend Richard Olowski and Bob Zabriskie when I was 14 years old at my high school. He hit a telephone pole and died instantly in his Corvette in front of Gene Hamilton's Chevrolet. And then the FBI, I think Osborne, who runs the sex crime division, the family that kidnapped me,
Mm-hmm.
in Michigan, that was Governor Osborne's family.
Yeah.
And he always ran against my family, Baldwin, and not the family my sister married. My sister married Brian Baldwin, but my girlfriend, Susan Baldwin, was the Baldwin family that ran against Osborne
Mm-hmm.
all the time to be governor back in the 1800s and 1900s. That was my girlfriend, Susan Baldwin. Brian Baldwin never knew his parents. He didn't even know where he came from.
And what did Osborne do?
He kidnapped me and my twin and murdered my twin
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
with Wallace, Long, Andrews, Anderson. And back then, Judge Andrews was on People's Court on TV in Detroit. And then you had Graham Media running the news, WWJ and Channel 4, with Roseanne Barr and Osborne. And Roseanne Barr made up this story that Hollywood was trying to use her, as my twin was murdered and I was sexually assaulted at 4. We were 4 years old by 5 grown gay men whose families were governors. It's just unbelievable. And L Brooks Patterson watched all this happen. And he protected those 5 governors' families his entire life.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he could collect 25 million a year in taxpayer money. And he
Yeah. And
collected that all the way to his death.
that same Osborne family runs the Trump campaign too. And it's the same
I
Osbornes you see in country music. That's the first homosexuals in
Stone cut the
country
bone
music.
out of my foot. Stone was illegally running a clinic, a hospital in Warren, Michigan, performing surgeries, and he had no medical training. And he got caught running this hospital performing surgeries. He told everybody he was a surgeon. And he was actually killing people. He got 30 years in prison, but he never served his 30 years. When I went back to Michigan to talk to L Brooks Patterson, I stopped in the Warren Police Department and I asked for my freedom of information request on Dr. Stone, who wasn't a doctor running a hospital. And they denied me my request because they were backing Trump.
Mm-hmm.
You got this picture?
Yep.
And I had 3 other times I was murdered and in hospitals. So I went to Beaumont and Troy, Beaumont in Royal Oak, and another hospital And I asked for my murder report from the doctors who saved my life, and they had destroyed all those records, and that's illegal. It's
Yeah,
illegal to destroy murder reports.
sure.
They destroyed any of the murders when they attempted to murder me. All the hospital records were destroyed.
Yeah, that same year you went up there to L
By
Brooks
Beaumont
Patterson.
Hospital, by Beaumont Hospital. And back
It,
then you had Ward Cleaver,
yeah,
and Beaumont Hospital was funded by Leave It to Beaver.
interesting. Yeah.
Jerry
Hugh,
Mathers.
Hugh Beaumont. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, Hugh Beaumont. And then you had Beaumont Hospital and Beaumont Hospital. And after they attempted to murder me, 3 doctors in Royal Oak attempted to save my life. And a doctor in Troy Beaumont saved my life. And all the murder cases disappeared.
Now, what about the time in 2017 there, the same year you went to go visit L Brooks Patterson and they poisoned you in Kentucky and you just barely made it to Indiana and you were in the
They murdered
hospital
Jim
again?
Mars. That's when they murdered Jim Mars. And
They
Jim
they
Mars,
did. The same day you woke up, they murdered Jim Mars, but did they have any reports? Have you ever asked them if they had any of your reports from being there?
no, I never went back.
Okay.
And but Jim Mars was murdered on that same day I was poisoned. And he was
Yeah.
looking into my stolen IRS licenses, and they were stolen with my name worldwide.
Yeah.
It was Huey Squire, I own Bottom Line Publishing. And he was looking into my stolen IRS licenses from the 60s when they
Just like
moved
just
him.
like this moon picture we have behind us, we saw on Channel
And
10.
then Judith Laurie Baker called me on the phone and told me Jim Mars had been murdered. And then I asked her about Robert Tosh Plumley, the supposed CIA agent with Lee Harvey Oswald, her supposed boyfriend. And her whole family had worked with my family, and she married into my family, the Baker family.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, no, Robert Tosh Plumley never lived with her. And Robert Tosh Plumley was putting all over the internet that he lived with Judith Laurie Baker.
Yeah.
And he's supposed to be a CIA agent telling the truth of Kennedy.
Right. Can't believe a thing that guy says.
I can't believe anything anybody says to me
Right.
because I lived all these things. Judith Baker's parents worked with my family at Chrysler on 9 Mile and Mound, Chrysler Corporation.
Not everybody listening to this is automatically going to know who that is. You might want to say who that is.
Well, that was Lee Harvey Oswald's boyfriend, and
Girlfriend.
Jack Ruby shot Oswald after they framed him for killing Kennedy, and he didn't kill Kennedy. I know he didn't kill Kennedy.
Right.
Just like Sirhan didn't kill Bobby.
Again, that was Osborne.
Yeah, with the FBI. Hoover. Anderson was Hoover's boyfriend. And Anderson was kidnapping and raping me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was J. Edgar Hoover's boyfriend.
And Osborne and Anderson were buddies that were raping you in the basement there
And that's
at
who
4
was
years
killing
old.
the kids in Oakland County. And L Brooks Patterson knew it, and he covered it all up, and they gave him $25 million a year to
Yeah.
keep his mouth shut.
Yeah.
That's what that was all about. And then my father stopped the illegal gun and drug trade run by the Senate via the Brown and Martin family. You had Peter Pan, Mary Martin, and they were running drugs with the Senate. And he did that just before Kennedy was murdered. And then in 79, I stopped an illegal gun and drug trade run on a farm I bought from Trump's tax attorney, Mazar, run by the Senate. And that turned out to be Noriega. And they gave the world Oliver North as they put me in jail for a year for stopping an illegal gun and drug trade. as they kidnapped my daughter at 7 off her school bus with the Kennedy family girl. They were both 7 years old. They kidnapped them, left them locked in an earth mover, and they were going to bury them. And none of this is in the news. And this is as they murdered my daughter's doctor, James Brandenburg.
Mm-hmm.
And the judge that gave me custody of my daughter, because her mother
Murdered him, yeah.
left the kids with me and didn't tell me her son was on phenobarbital and he died in my arms.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to say earlier, a lot earlier, that I walked in on her having sex with a homicide detective that was supposed to be protecting my life. I came home early from work, walked in my back door, and he was laying on top of her having sex with her in front of my daughter, eating breakfast in her high chair.
Mm-hmm.
And I had come home that day because all the power went out at work and we couldn't work. And I didn't divorce her for that. I stayed married to her because of the kids. And for the next 3 weeks, she went and lived with this homicide detective at his house, had sex with him daily, come back to my home, told me she was pregnant, and then she gave that kid my name. You got this picture?
Mm-hmm.
So she had sex with a homicide detective in the Warren Police Department for 3 weeks on a daily basis, got pregnant, and gave that kid my name.
Mm-hmm.
And I know he's not my kid because he has curly hair and I never did.
Mm-hmm.
My hair is brown, his hair is blonde, like the homicide detective's brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
And he's twice my size. And Nancy was smaller than me. It makes no sense. But he has my name, and he's the homicide detective's son. And his mother had sex with him on a daily basis for almost a month. And he threw her out. Somebody bitched about him living with my wife when he was supposed to be protecting me. He threw her out. She came back and gave that kid, his kid, my name. So it's just unbelievable, my life. And that was Nancy Lavoie, who the FBI shot. When they shot Lavoie Finicum, they murdered her. And then her new husband, Jeff Lavoie, told me what a bad person I was taking her kids.
Hmm.
But she had raped me. She was 21 when I was 14. She had raped me, got pregnant, come to me and asked for money for an abortion. Can you imagine raping a kid and then asking him for money for an abortion? You
Yeah.
got the picture?
Right.
That's exactly what she did.
Well, you did say she was insane.
And then she gave another kid, another man's kid, my name.
Yeah.
Hiding what she had done.
Right.
You know, it's just interesting.
And then stabbed you in the back with a knife.
Yeah, that's why I divorced her, and I
Mhm.
took her kids.
Yeah.
I took her kids because she left the boy she named with my name. She left them at my home in Troy, Michigan. I had just built without his phenobarbital, and he had a heart attack in my arms. She didn't even tell me he was having grand mal seizures. Never told me she had phenobarbital for him, and he died in my arms.
Wow.
I revived him, took him to a hospital, and the hospital told me he was having grand mal seizures, and he had a prescription of phenobarbital for the seizures.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, I took her kids from her, and we
Yeah.
were already divorced. I divorced her because she tried to murder me. She stabbed me in the back with a butcher knife and pushed me down 2 flights of stairs. trying to murder me. So when women tried to murder me, I divorced them. And that's when my second wife, the witch, whose family murdered Jimmy Hoffa, I divorced her when her family started trying to murder me. I divorced,
Yeah. Right.
and they don't seem to understand that.
Right.
You know, they always act surprised. Why did you divorce me? Well, because you tried to kill me.
Right.
You know,
Kind of a good reason. Yeah.
yeah. So I divorced my first two wives within 7 years because their families tried to murder me.
Right. And the first one herself tried to murder you with a knife. Now I knew about her pushing you down the stairs, but I had never heard, I don't think I'd ever heard about your brother pushing you off the roof. That one's one I hadn't heard yet.
Because I never said it.
Yeah.
But that was just before my Aunt Gardner died, and she was in charge of my grandfather's will. And
Right.
she was his daughter. Her real name was Harris.
Mm-hmm.
She married Mr. Gardner, and Mr.
Okay.
Gardner spent his whole life in prison,
Okay.
you know. And that's how I'm related to Ava Gardner,
I see. Okay.
through her marriage to the Gardner family.
Right. Right.
And then the aunts that stole my inheritance with my brother,
Mm-hmm.
they said she was never married, like she was the Gardner family, and this is a big lie. And then the family that kidnapped my daughter off her school bus is the ones that signed her death certificate,
Yeah.
saying
Yeah.
she was never married. And I met her husband. She drove me 300 miles to meet her husband in Marquette State Prison when I was 7 years old. And none of my family knows this. She just showed up at my mother's house one day and wanted me to meet her husband and her daughter. And I met them
Wow.
in prison.
Well, that definitely proves that he was there.
No, well, there's articles about it. You can look up Gardner in Marquette State Prison. There's all kinds of articles about him being in prison.
Well, yeah. Mm-hmm. No doubt.
And then when the Beatles came here from Epstein, and that's another Epstein, and Epstein was a German town, a Nazi town in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
When Bush put Hitler in power, Prescott Bush put Hitler in power before World War II.
And Epstein was in that prison with your relative there.
Right.
Yeah.
Not
Mr. Gardner.
Epstein, Sinclair. David Sinclair introduced the Beatles
Yeah.
to
Right.
Ed Sullivan, and he was my card partner. My uncle in jail looked after Sinclair, who
Okay.
introduced the Beatles from Epstein. I think his name was Brian Epstein, was the Beatles manager. And that's a
Yeah.
Nazi town in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Just like Jeffrey Epstein was selling kids to the presidents and the King of England. Same family.
Hmm.
Both from Epstein, Germany. A Nazi
Fascinating.
town. As the Queen married Hitler's SS guard, the current King of England is Hitler's SS guard's son. And he's running all of America's media.
Mm-hmm.
They write the history books you study out of in the high schools and colleges. Via the Bourne Company, Elvis Presley's publisher. And all of this is true.
I noticed when we were talking about Trump there last time and how Kamala was from India and we had different people from India running for president and vice president and so forth, several at the same time. All of a sudden, Trump says he's not going to go for, not going to allow Haley because I know it's because you had talked about it. And immediately he denounced Haley off the ticket. It was so obvious to me.
Well, I was born with a tail, and in India, I'm a prophet. There's no lie in this. They cut the tail off the day I was
Yeah.
born.
Yeah, over there, yeah. Anybody born with a tail in India,
But
they're
I'm
like,
not from India. My DNA is 100% European.
right,
I'm related to all the kings of Europe via my
right.
uncle Admiral Byrd.
Right. Yeah, but over there they really, yeah, somebody has that trait. They set them on a pedestals a 2, 3 year old. And,
How would my
yeah.
family know to throw King George out of the country? Washington's my family.
Hmm.
President Jackson, how did they know to throw King George out of the country to create America? It's because they were related to the kings.
Yeah. Right.
You understand this?
Yeah, of course.
Um, and then they used the Masons Lodge to plan the Revolutionary War. And then when the
Right.
war was over, they stopped going to them. And they weren't going to Masons lodges in the United States. They were going to Masons lodges in Europe, planning the revolution. And all of history, they don't teach you this. I know these things firsthand because they're my family. My family wrote the King James Bible. And I don't believe that Bible. And I can tell you why. Just like Israel just killed 15,000 kids in Gaza in one afternoon, King James murdered 100 priests and scribes writing the King James Bible. It's real evident that's not God's family.
Yeah,
I
originally,
said the main commandment in the Bible is thou shalt not murder. And all of the people writing the Bibles murder. They're not inspired by God.
yeah.
And this is a no-brainer. They wrote the Bible to control the masses. At
Yep.
that time in Europe, America didn't exist yet.
Right.
Uh,
Now in Boston, the where the first Mason Tavern was, where they planned the revolution here, they had originally been meeting with this, the other soldiers from, because before the revolution they were all on the same side, so they would plan battles against Indians and stuff like that, from the Bunch of Grapes Tavern in Boston, and they would meet there with the 47th Regiment of Foot and all that, and then it was after that they broke
that was the
away.
King's Army, but then they were meeting over in Europe in the same Mason lodges planning the revolution against King George.
Yeah, that's why you see it happening
And
here,
the
right?
one you're talking about, that was the first Masons lodge in the country.
Yeah. Hmm.
And they planned the revolution from Mason lodges in Europe.
Yeah, because you had to
They
hide
even,
from the
they
king.
even wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights
Yeah.
in those lodges after they won the revolution.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then they all stopped going to the lodges. And they tell you they're all Illuminati. This is all BS.
Yeah, George Washington got out of it, right?
This is all BS. It's
Yeah.
just BS.
Yeah.
They call George Washington a Illuminati, and he's not.
Right.
I'm related to all the presidents on money,
Yeah.
and you know yourself, I'm not a Mason.
Right. We have Washington's Masonic apron here in Marietta, Marietta, Ohio, but he eventually quit the Masons, just like he
Right.
eventually subscribed,
After they
gave his
planned the
slaves
revolution
to.
and won it,
Yeah.
they no longer needed the lodges.
Right. Just
But
like he gave us.
they don't teach you that in school.
Well, he was
And then
smart.
you
He
get
was
all
think.
these theories
Yeah.
about their Illuminati, and they're not Illuminati. They planned the revolution inside the king's own lodges.
Washington had to have been one of the smartest men that ever lived. I mean, he gave up power, he gave away his slaves, he got out of the Masons. I mean, he was thinking with the foresight of being a humble, decent person who's starting a new country and realizing what it takes to pass that legacy on down through
My murdered
generations.
wife was the brigadier general who protected New York from the King George's armies in
Yeah,
1776.
amazing, isn't it?
Two
Wow.
policemen murdered her,
Yeah. Hmm.
kidnapped her out of her CPS Head Start office in Menominee, Wisconsin, illegally drove her across 5 state lines. She
Right.
called me for help. I put her in Tennessee, and they followed her to Tennessee and murdered her there.
Hmm.
And then her own sister helped murder her. She was recovering. The nurses came to me when her sister had her overdosed and murdered a second time.
Mhm.
I found her hung in her dog's leash.
Yeah.
30 minutes after she told me she was being stalked again by police.
Yeah. Mm.
I gave her CPR, got her into the hospital, and 30 days later, the sister she had a fist fight with murdered her so she could take her money. And I
Right.
don't think this, I know these things. And I couldn't say a word because they wouldn't allow me in the hospital with my own fiance.
Hmm.
The police were trying to tell me I murdered her. And I gave her CPR and got her into the hospital alive. It makes no sense.
Hmm.
And then when her family got there, they just automatically believed the police that she committed suicide. And she wasn't suicidal. She was very happy. She was planning to be married with me.
Yeah. Well, this shows very much how our family has, or I mean, our country's been attacked and the families of the founders have been attacked. People like her, whose relatives, General Heath, helped George Washington secure Boston. That's from the British, and why the British would be after her all these years
It's just
later.
unbelievable. It's
Hmm.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
And she created the Head Start program for President Reagan.
Hmm.
She didn't even get an obituary in Tennessee.
Right. Right.
No murder report. The police left the murders up to God.
And instead, they created an Alex Jones after Alex Jones III and created InfoWars. It's unbelievable.
My first girlfriend was Sandy Locke. You have Sandy Hook. Alex
Yeah.
Jones was calling Sandy Locke a hooker,
Hmm.
and she's not.
Right.
And
Right.
Locke fire extinguishers are in every fire department on earth.
Mm.
He should have known better. He
Yeah.
was marking me. Remember, he would report about Tim McVeigh and Nichols. And they were my next door neighbors.
Yeah. Hmm.
I lived next door to John Nichols for 30 years.
Yeah.
McVeigh would come to my farm and buy the drugs, LSD, and use it
Yeah.
from the time he was a little kid. He started using LSD when he was like 10 years old.
Mm.
And he got it from people like Bucky Larson, born to be a star. They made movie stars out of all the drug dealers on the back of my farm,
Yeah.
living in the worker homes.
And that's why you had the Bike Riders movie that I just saw on TV this week. An
Exactly.
advertisement for with
And that
Nichols
was the
made it.
Westhouse family. And all the bikers would meet on his farm, and that's where they buried James Hoffa.
Right. Wow. Well, that's I think we done our hour, but that's for not sure what we were going to talk about to this much information, and it's a lot of information.
Everything
Uh,
I've said is true.
yeah,
And
yeah, I
because
know.
it's not on Fox News, everybody thinks I'm lying.
And yet Fox is run by the British that are attacking our country, just like
It's run by the
CNN and
London Throne.
just like all
So
the
is
rest of them.
CNN. CNN is run by the BBC. CBS is the Canadian Broadcasting System.
Mhm.
All American news that matters is run by London.
And every one of them use your stolen trademark bottom line.
Bottom line. That's
It's un
exactly correct.
unfreaking, and that's why nobody knows your story. Nobody's heard it. We should stop right there. That is a good place to stop.
Take care.
So,
I'll send it to
okay.
you in the email. Bye.
Okay. Have a good night.
Put it on YouTube. Bye.
Good night.